Welcome back to the LeaderLink podcast. This is your host, Charles Heasley, and today we're going to talk about expectations. Have you ever been frustrated because somebody doesn't do what you want them to do? Or maybe they don't do it the way you want them to do it, or maybe they don't do it by the time you want it done. And it's easy to get frustrated because we think that people should know what to do. They should know how to do it. They should know when to do it by. But this is often really a cause of a lack of clear expectations. And there's a concept that we teach in our programs called mutual mystification. And the idea is essentially, I won't tell you what I'm thinking, and then we'll both be surprised when you don't do what I expect. And it really, it's unfair to the employee, but it also is unfair to the organization. And I struggle with the word fairness sometimes, but if people know what the mark is, if they know what the bar is, and then they don't meet the expectation, then we have a different problem. That could be maybe they don't have enough authority to do what we need them to do. Maybe they don't have enough training. Maybe they don't have enough resources. Maybe they don't have enough coaching. That's a different problem. But if people don't know what to do because we're not telling them what we want and very clearly, specifically, then we're doing a disservice to both that employee and the organization. And this is actually really built into my story and I've shared this in a previous episode where I asked my chain of command, my lieutenant had not given me clear expectations. The chief was giving me orders that were bypassing the chain of command, and it was a brand new unit. I basically had to build it from the ground up. There was no policy written. There was no, really, I had no framework, no guidelines to go off of. And when I clearly wasn't meeting the mark, I asked my boss, I said, hey, can we sit down and talk about my expectations? And the answer was cowardice. It was, you signed up for this, you should know what to do. Again, there's that word should. It's a terrible word for a leader. And I said, but I don't know what success looks like, because clearly we're not working together as well as we could be. I'm trying to do these things for our department, for my team, and I'm getting a lot of pushback, and I don't understand. And at the same time, I'm getting a lot of direction outside the chain of command, and there's a mismatch, there's a misalignment. All I want to do is get clarity on my expectations. And I asked for a meeting. I asked for a formal meeting, and it was denied. Don't do that. That's not good. The people who work for you want to do a good job by and large, and in order to do that good job, they need to know what that job looks like. They need to know what success looks like, and they need to know how to do it. In a similar story, I was actually just coaching a group of leaders that there was one guy in the class in the group, and we were talking about expectations, which expectations is actually one of my favorite topics when it comes to leadership, because you would think that this is something that everybody should know, but most leaders have never set clear expectations for their people. Some do, and I don't know how they learned it, but it is not something that is generally taught. And so most leaders are never given expectations, and most leaders never set expectations. And again, this causes all sorts of issues. What this ends up looking like is accountability issues. Who's to blame? This didn't get done. This didn't get done the right way. This didn't get done by the deadline. Who's to blame? And this is one of the reasons why accountability has such a bad rap, because accountability is often brought into the equation without clear expectations being set. It's very critical that we set those expectations up front, and then we check in on those expectations. We coach those expectations. So I was with this group, and one of the leaders in the class was telling me that he had basically been asked to begin the termination process for one of the employees. And he was like, but that doesn't make sense, because after participating in the group and discussing the different categories of expectations, he realized that in almost every area of this employee's work, he was knocking it out of the park. He was a stand-up employee. He had good character, a good attitude, and it was just this one area that he wasn't living up to expectations. And what this leader realized is that the expectations for this one area were never fully communicated. And now we're talking about potentially firing this person. Well, the success story behind this is that he was able to talk to his boss and say, hey, can we try this out? Can we revisit the expectations, clearly define them, provide training, resources, whatever the case is here. And they were able to save this job. They were able to save this person's job. And people might say, oh, well, expectations isn't that big of it. It's a huge deal. It's huge, because people want to do a good job. I'm going to break expectations down just a little bit, and I like to categorize them into 4 buckets, 4 areas, call it whatever you want. The first bucket is results, and this is probably the one that most people tend to focus on when they think about expectations. And really, this is the outcome, the job. What does success look like for you? And this is going to obviously be industry dependent. It's going to be role dependent. The example of the widget maker, the expectation, the result is make the widget, do it to specification, and do it on time. Those kinds of basic results. And I think it's important to set the expectations on results. But we can't just stop there. The next one that I think people shy away from just a little bit is behavior. So the first bucket is results. What does the job actually look like? Again, hard to really go into on a podcast for all kinds of leaders, because the job is going to look differently for everyone. But the second one, behavior, some leaders are not really sure that they can hold people accountable to behavior, but you absolutely can, and you should. There was an article, I believe it was a Korn Ferry article, talking about how the work from home situation, apparently some leaders were allowing people to work from home specifically because their attitude was so bad in the office, and they didn't want to do anything about the attitude or have that conversation. So instead of holding them accountable to having a better attitude, they just let them work from home, which, I guess that's a solution. It's not the one I would choose, but one of the behaviors you can hold people accountable to is the outcome of those attitudes. Like, you can't necessarily say, you can't pass judgment on an attitude, because that typically is related to feelings, and a person's feelings you may not agree with, but that doesn't necessarily mean that they're wrong for that person. But the outcome of those attitudes can have a disastrous impact. A bad attitude can become toxic. A bad attitude can show up in behaviors that are destructive to the team's performance, or the organization's performance. They can come across if that person interacts with customers or vendors. And so while it is a little bit harder to hold somebody accountable to attitude, I think it can still be possible, but it is essential to hold them accountable to the behaviors that come from those attitudes. So, for example, you can establish an expectation that says treat coworkers with respect. That is completely legitimate. You can do the same for customers or vendors. You can basically talk about, how do I expect you to conduct yourself and carry yourself as an employee representing this organization? That is possible, and that should happen. That should be one of your expectations. So we've got results, we've got behavior, and the third bucket is going to be ownership. So what do I expect you to own in your role? And one of the reasons why this one is so big is because I come from law enforcement, and a lot of people in that industry, they will do everything they can to avoid doing anyone else's work. So just as an example, there was an intersection in the city that I worked in that part of the intersection was one city and part of the intersection was another city. And so if there was a traffic crash in the middle of this intersection, you would have an officer from one city and an officer from the other city, and instead of going and helping the people in the cars, they would be arguing about, is this yours or is this mine? They would go out of their way to not do anyone else's work. They had no problem doing their own work, but they would go out of their way to avoid doing someone else's work. And a lot of industries, you can't get away with that. For one example, hospitality. I've got a friend who runs a luxury resort hotel, and basically, if a customer comes to you with a problem, you own that problem till it's solved. Now, you may enlist the help of other people. You may get another department involved, but you remain. You keep ownership of that until there is resolution. There are so many examples we could share for ownership, but basically, set the expectation and help people understand, at what point do I own a task? At what point do I own completion of this? At what point do I own the communication of it or the reporting? What is it that I need to do? And if I need to collaborate or work with somebody else and it's not necessarily within my area of responsibility or expertise, to what extent do I own that? I think that in the industries that I've coached since leaving law enforcement, I don't tend to see that as much. I know it still happens, but not to the degree that I saw in law enforcement. Just the absolute dislike of doing anything else that belonged to anyone else. Not every industry is going to be like that, but we need to clearly define, at what point do you own assisting, at what point do you own taking that task on. The final bucket is communication, and this one seems obvious, but there are plenty of situations where things don't get communicated until they're a fire. And so one of the things that I recommend setting an expectation on is, at what point does something need to get escalated to my level? I'm a big fan of handling things at the lowest level possible, but that doesn't mean that that person will not need help or support or guidance or something along the way. So at what point do I need to know that there's a problem and that my intervention may be needed, or some coaching or training or resources or collaboration or whatever may be necessary? And another thing is communication on, at what point do I need to just know regular things? As you begin to delegate more and more and more, then a lot of tasks that were on your plate will eventually go to other people, and you still have to make sure those things get done. So at what point do I need to have you check in with me to say, yes, this has been done? And that doesn't necessarily need to be a phone call or an email or a stop in the office. You can use, like, for example, when we record these podcasts, we use a Google spreadsheet to let each other know what the status of each stage is. There's a lot of different ways to do that, but the point is that make it clear. Give specific, clear expectations, and you don't necessarily have to use the buckets that I like, but I think that is fairly comprehensive. Some of the buckets will actually relate to each other. For example, ownership and communication relate to each other. Behavior and communication really relate to each other. Ownership and results relate to each other. But my recommendation is break those 4 buckets down, put 2 or 3 expectations in each one, and then actually tell the employee what those are. And you'll usually find that they want to know. And one thing you can say or ask is, does this expectation seem realistic? And you can get real-time feedback. Now, you're ultimately going to have the final say as the leader in whether or not that remains an expectation. But now you're trying to get an agreement from the person that, yes, that is reasonable, I can meet that, and that conversation, that verbal confirmation, will come back later if there's ever an issue with them not making those expectations. All right, one of my favorite topics to talk about. This is one of the ones that I really like to get in depth with organizations and leaders, because every industry is a little bit different. So it can't necessarily generalize too much on a podcast without focusing on one specific industry. But take it, run with it. Let me know what your thoughts are. You can send me an email, charles@bluelionleadership.com, if you have any questions, and we'll see you next time.